There are all sorts of rumors about their helping or taking credit occasionally for bringing me down. My view is I brought myself down.
Alex Gibney is the director of Client 9. He's joining us from New York City tonight. Mr. Gibney, thanks very much for being here.
Great to be here.
So what is it about this story that you think rivets people so much still?
Well, I think the rise and fall, that goes back to Greek mythology. I mean, Elliot Spitzer in the film says it himself. It's the story of Icarus in some ways. And I think it's a story of hypocrisy. I mean, this is the sheriff of Wall Street who had prosecuted escort services and then was found to be using them. And I think this is also a story of larger-than-life figures. I mean, this was the guy also who took on the titans of Wall Street and then fell just at the very moment that Wall Street was going into its own meteoric descent.
You see a kind of humanity in him that you did not see before. Did he really come off to you as humanized, and do you think that he told you the truth to the extent that he was capable?
I think he did. I mean, I think, you know, you always wonder when you're talking to somebody, you know, if they're telling you the truth, if they're telling you what they want you to hear. But I think over time, and I did conduct 5 long on-camera interviews with him, as well as talking to him a lot off-camera, that he was telling the truth. He may not have been able to go to places or to understand clearly why he did what he did, and I think that's still an issue for him. But in the main, I think he was a truth teller, and I also think I caught him at a moment prior to him going back on TV in various talk shows and so forth, where he was more reflective. And I think he was in the midst of his own personal agony about the fact that at the very moment when he could have contributed most in the midst of this economic cataclysm, he was sidelined by a scandal that he himself had precipitated.
Did you like him?
I did. I did like him. That also surprised me. I mean, I always saw him from afar as an imperious figure. One of the things that surprised me was his sense of humor. It didn't occur to me that he really had a good sense of humor, because I didn't see that much on display. Yeah, I did like him.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because this idea about him as a guy who had this incredible temper but also could be sort of self-deprecating before the whole hooker scandal. I mean, there was a humor to him. You know, you've been criticized, though, about this movie that it's been too sympathetic of a view of him. It is an awfully sympathetic view. I mean, it spends a lot of time talking about something that he likes to be reminded of and remembered for, which is, in fact, his reign as Attorney General, which, you know, really was probably his high point in public service.
It does spend a lot of time, but I think that was, in a way, a kind of necessary corrective, because the scandal, which was a very juicy scandal, you know, had blinded us to the past and to many of his accomplishments. So I felt it was fair to go back and look at that, because in effect that also makes the scandal all the more shocking and surprising. But it was important to also see that in its context. In terms of the film being too sympathetic to Elliot Spitzer, I mean, I would point out that it's pretty tough on him in many ways, particularly regarding the scandal, and the fact that he knew very well the enemies that were arrayed against him. He knew the stakes. He knew all the people who were depending on him, and yet somehow, some way, he let them all down. He let himself down, and he put himself in this state of risk, which put it all, in effect, at risk. So I'm not sure the film lets him off the hook in that sense.
No, I don't think so either. But it also, I mean, he let the whole state down, right? He was the man who rode in on his white horse, who was supposed to rescue the state, and now we arguably set the state back even further into its sort of mire of dysfunction, and touched off several years of scandal, actually. And you do entertain some of those sort of conspiracy theories about Langone, Ken Langone, and Hank Greenberg. Do you believe them? I mean, what in the end do you really believe brought this guy down, aside from obviously that he gave them fodder with which to bring him down if they did?
Well, if it was a political hit, let's be honest and say he supplied his enemies with the weapon and the ammunition. But let's also be honest and say that the way he was outed was extremely unconventional. The federal investigation was deeply flawed and seemed more angled toward figuring out how he could be embarrassed rather than how he could be properly prosecuted. No charges were ever brought. It's also true that, you know, in the case of his enemies, they were talking amongst each other. And in the case of Ken Langone, one very odd detail remains. You know, the very day that Spitzer was outed, Ken Langone is caught, you know, leaving a restaurant saying, "Oh yeah, a friend of mine happened to be behind Elliot Spitzer in the post office when he went and got an $1,800 money order for a hooker." Really? Ken Langone has a lot of friends who are in post offices, and they happen to be so close to Elliot Spitzer that they're looking over his shoulder to see him write out the number $1,800 for hooker. So, you know, it raises a lot of questions. But at the end of the day, it is true that Elliot Spitzer brought himself down.
You know, there are also all of these questions, maybe that's why people are so fascinated, that never really got answered. For example, the duration of the time that he actually spent with prostitutes. Did it go into the time? How deeply did it go into the time that he was in office as Attorney General? And then also, of course, his relationship with his wife, Silda, which is talked about some here, but she stuck with him, and I think people are curious about that too. I mean, do you have any insight into either of those?
Well, we're fairly certain, and Elliot confirms this, that his visits to escorts started in around March of '06. That's while he's still Attorney General. In terms of his relationship with Silda, you know, that's not something I'm privy to. But a lot of people criticize Silda for, in effect, standing by her man, you know, when he announced this scandal and also when he resigned. From what I understand, that was a very impromptu event. This is a relationship that's very strong and very deep, and in some ways, rightly or wrongly, Elliot Spitzer, I think, decided that he was going to see prostitutes as opposed to have an affair because he felt it wouldn't challenge the emotional bond between himself and his wife. Now, say what you want about that, but that's one of the rationales that he had for doing what he did.
Do you, now of course he's back on TV, as you mentioned. Have you seen the show?
He has seen the film, and he pronounced it fair. He quipped that he wished the ending were different, but there was nothing I could do about that. He wrote the ending, not me.
No, I'm sorry. What I meant, have you seen Parker Spitzer? Have you seen him on TV?
Oh, I'm sorry. Have I seen Parker Spitzer? Yes, I have seen Parker Spitzer.
What do you think?
Well, as an amateur viewer, as simply a member of the audience, I personally wish they let him off his leash more. I like to see Elliot Spitzer go after people. I like to see him challenge people. I think that's what he's good at. He was born to be an Attorney General, and on behalf of the citizens, it would be interesting to see him go after people more often. I'd like to see that.
Do you think he'll make a comeback? Because there's so much speculation about it, even that this film could at some point help make people more sympathetic about him.
I didn't make the film for that reason, but I do think that if there is to be a political future for Elliot Spitzer, he has to reckon with why he did what he did. And I think this film takes a lot of that into account. I think there may be a future for him, and ironically, it may be a brighter future in part because of what happened. I think one of Spitzer's biggest problems as a political figure was his arrogance, his sense that he was beyond reproach. I'm not sure he would approach the political process that way anymore, or nor would anybody else.
Well, it just is amazing to me that there's such an appetite for it. The film is coming out on November 5th, I believe, in wide release, if I'm not mistaken.
November 5th it comes out in New York. November 12th it comes out around the country.
Okay, so
New York City, I should say.
If people are, I'm sure, going to be looking for it. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much, Alex Gibney, for stopping by and chatting with us.
Very good to be here.